Greetings and welcome to TrainSignal. You're watching Managing Databases. So in this lesson, we're going to talk about Exchange Database Management. Every email that goes to your mailbox server must go into a database, and this creates challenges because of the huge variety of messages that Exchange handles. Really, you can get a message that's 1 kilobyte in size, or you can have messages that have a PowerPoint document or pictures or a video, and really this could make for a message size that goes 10 megabytes, 20 megabytes. It really just depends. And so Exchange has to be prepared to handle this random variety of different messages that are coming its way. All of it goes into a database. So the question is, how does Exchange handle its database management internally, as well as what we can do to ensure that we're giving the database our attention, making sure that we follow best practices and so forth. Okay, so let's get started. As mentioned, the I/O profile of a mailbox server is not predictable. With Exchange 2010, the ESE engine received enhancements to improve I/O by 70%. That means that Exchange 2010 can read and write emails to disk 70% faster than Exchange 2007 using the same engine. So that's something to think about. There was a tremendous improvement already with Exchange 2010. Now the Exchange team is saying that there's another 50% IOPS reduction over Exchange 2010. So from Exchange 2010 to 2013, another 50% reduction is what's predicted here. So when you look at that, really going all the way back to 2003, with the 2013 rewritten Managed Store, the Exchange team now claims 99% reduction in I/O or IOPS, that's IOPS, that's input output per second, from 2003 to 2013. So what does this change mean? Well, it means much better support for multiple databases per volume or drive. It means JBOD, or just a bunch of disk support, is improved further from what we saw with 2007 and 2010. And so what that means is that you can get a lot more performance out of Exchange without having to spend a tremendous amount of money on high performance disks. Now, in some cases, you may want to spend that kind of money. You may have a lot of faith in high performance SAN solutions, but in other cases, your organization may be cutting back and you want performance, but you don't want to spend the money on a SAN solution. And so having better performance when it comes to the database is really valuable because we can see increased performance without increased costs when it comes to the disks that we have to purchase. So just to reiterate, better IOPS performance mean flexibility in storage options. We can still go out and buy those high-end storage SANs, or we can go with lower cost SATA disks or JBOD storage. Now it's important to review something we've talked about already, but the point on how mail goes from the wire to the database. We know that the mail comes in, it hits that Exchange server. The first thing that happens is it hits memory. From memory, an email does not go right into the database. Now remember, a mailbox database is stored as an Exchange database, an EDB file. In Exchange 2013, each mailbox database has its own properties that you can configure, and we're going to take a look at those properties in a moment. But you can see here, before that email goes into the database, it's written to transaction logs. The current log is E00, and then additional logs build up. We're going to take a look at this in a moment, but those logs will then be written into the EDB database file. Now, in addition, there's also a checkpoint file that keeps track of which logs were written into the database. Now, when you first install Exchange, what you'll notice is that the first mailbox database is usually put right in the same location as where you installed Exchange to start with. So if you install it on the C drive, then somewhere in your installation files, you'll have a location for your EDB file as well as all of the transaction logs. That location is not the best one for your database file or for your transaction logs. So let's talk about how we can improve both the performance as well as the recoverability of our Exchange databases. So some database best practice suggestions include placing the transaction logs and the database file on separate disks. So you want these off of the system disk and or the location where Exchange is installed. So you might have your system disk C and you might have Exchange installed either on C or onto another drive letter. It really just depends on how you've done this in your environment. But ultimately, what you don't want is the database file in the same location as either one, the system disk or the location of your Exchange, or your transaction logs in either one of those locations. One best practice option from years back is that you place transaction logs on a mirrored volume and you place database files on a RAID 5, some kind of array, that you now have your database files and transaction logs separated from each other, but set up in such a way that there's fault tolerance built in. And so you can see in doing it this way, your transaction logs and database files, they would be separate from your system disk or the location where Exchange is installed, and they would be set up in such a way that you would have redundancy and some kind of resiliency built in when it comes to the logs and database files. Now, what's important to keep in mind is that this is an old suggestion. It's still a good suggestion, but really in modern times, you might do better to look at high availability solutions like a database availability group, which we're going to talk about in a later lesson. So from a cost perspective, especially with the cost of disk storage being so cheap, you can just throw in a few extra drives and you can build out a solution like this in an environment where cost is a factor and you're not going to be adding additional Exchange servers to the mix. So if high availability is not an option and you're not looking at other methods for resiliency, redundancy, and so forth, then you do want to look at some of these suggestions in terms of splitting up the database files and transaction logs, as well as making sure that there's some form of redundancy and fault tolerance built in. Before we get into the various aspects of database management from a technical perspective, there are two other things that are worth mentioning. The first is that you do want to use the Exchange 2013 Mailbox Role Requirements Calculator to help you determine your storage needs. The second point that's worth mentioning is that Standard Edition of Exchange 2013 supports 5 databases, whereas Enterprise Edition supports 50 databases. Now, if that sounds awesome to you, it might be because you're not fully aware of what Exchange 2010 offered, which is 100 databases for the Enterprise Edition. So we're talking about on an Exchange server having the ability to have and mount 50 databases. That's the limitation in Exchange 2013. If you worked with Exchange 2010 and you did have an environment or do have an environment that has 100 databases, or let's say between 50 and 100 databases mounted on any given servers, well, you're going to have to take that into consideration when you transition over to Exchange 2013. This is a limitation. One of the reasons for it is because they did rewrite the store. So the new managed store is great, and it does allow you to have individual processes for each mounted database. But at the same time, they were not entirely convinced of the stability, so they reduced the limit down to 50 databases, although we might see that increase with Service Pack 1. So what are some of the tasks that we might perform as part of database management? Well, certainly creating a mailbox database would be a reasonable task. Getting and setting mailbox database properties is another aspect of database management. Now you can do that through the EAC, or you can use the get-mailbox database commandlet and then the set-mailbox database commandlet. Mounting and dismounting databases. When you dismount a database, you pretty much render it inactive in the sense that it now cannot service mailbox requests. So emails cannot come into it. If there are mailboxes in that database, they will not receive email at this point, and individuals cannot access their mailboxes during this time. There are a variety of different reasons why you might have to dismount a database, especially if there's a problem with the database or if you're restoring information. So there are reasons to dismount the database, but for the most part, you want your databases mounted, up and running, and ready to service requests for both incoming and outgoing email. At times, you may want to move a mailbox database path. You can do that using the move-database path commandlet. And a good reason for doing this would be, let's say you did put your mailbox database in a location that was not the best when it comes to best practices. Let's say it was on the system drive, like the default database that we have currently, or let's say one of the other databases that we have. If it's in the wrong location and really not following best practice, then you might want to move that database. And as you'll see in a moment, when we look at the database properties, there are limits and maintenance options that we can configure that relate to things like quotas on the database and relate to things like deleted item or deleted mailbox retention times and various aspects like that. We can also make adjustments to the database with regard to things like circular logging, which is not something we've discussed just yet, but once we take a look, I'll explain what some of these features do. So let's jump over to our server and let's take a look at some of the database management options that we have. And here we are on our Windows server running 2012. Before we jump in and log into the EAC, let's just take a quick look once again at the existing structure for our Exchange databases. If we go to Computer, and if we take a look at the program files, we look at Microsoft, Exchange Server, v15, Mailbox, and here we see the different databases. Database 2, and this was the database that was created when we actually installed Exchange. So they're both located on the C drive. That's not the best location for them here. If we open this up, we can see that we have the database file itself. Notice that's the largest file in the folder. We have the checkpoint file right here. We have the current log, and then we have the various we have the current log, we have some additional reserved logs that are just ready there, and then we have the logs that are kind of filling up as we go along. And you can see these logs, they're only 1 megabyte in size, but they do add up, as you can see here, as they get closed out and then saved off with another name, they do add up. So this is the structure here. We have the logs and we have the database files. The log should be on a separate disk, and both should be off of the C drive here itself. And so that's what we need to accomplish at some point in the future. We'll worry about that later. For now, we're going to jump over to the EAC. Let's log in. And from here, in order to see the database information, we go to Servers. And we only have the one server. We go to Databases. And we can see we have our two databases. We have the one that was originally created when we did the install. And we have the secondary one, which actually is the one that contains all of our mailboxes at this point. So if we look at this, to create an additional database, we just click the plus sign. And here's where we give it a name. We choose the server. In our case, there's only one server. We provide the database file path, which by default, it will put it in the same location as the other two. So if we do want to divide the database and log folder paths, put them on a separate drive altogether, we have to indicate that. And then here's the checkbox to mount the database. So we'll do this again in a moment because we're going to create an additional database for Spytech Prime, our organization that we're working for. If we look here, we can see that we can look at some details over in the section here that gives us some information on the right. If we look at View Details, it can tell us things like the database name, the mailbox server, is it in a healthy state, is it mounted, what is the copy queue length or replay queue length, which is at 0 at this point. So we can look at this and see some information. At the same time, if we choose to edit the database, we click Edit, we can see a lot of that information right there. That's similar to the basic information that we just saw, but now you can see that there are additional tabs here that we can look at. If we look under Maintenance, we can see that we can actually configure a journal recipient for this database, and what that basically means is that all email coming in and out of this database will be journaled and sent over to a journal recipient. So that would be a mailbox that would be set up where all email messages would go in there, and so it's one way to be more compliant when it comes to making sure that all email is retained in some location. Then we can see here the maintenance schedule. This is the schedule as we see it here from 12 to 4, 4:30, 5 o'clock, somewhere in there. And you can customize that. And so maintenance has to be performed on the database. It has to go through a defragmentation process, and then there's also a background database maintenance that's taking place here. You can see this is checked. This is where the database is checked 24/7 and is scanned for any problems or anomalies that might come up. So this background database maintenance, this is also called database checksumming, and basically it's the ability to look and see if the database is working properly, if there are any problems with it, things that go on in the background. You can also select don't mount this database at startup. You can say this database can be overwritten by a restore, and this option is typically chosen when you want to restore a database if you are restoring from backup. You can enable circular logging. Now circular logging, what that basically does is it makes it so that although the database itself will continue to grow and will continue to have email added to it and users can see that email and so forth, the transaction logs will not be retained. So this is a way to preserve disk space, and really it's an older method of preserving disk space. It was used at times in the past when you might have a database that wasn't really essential to maintain the transaction logs. You weren't really too concerned. Let's say you had a grouping of temp workers. It didn't matter if the transaction logs were retained for them or not. If their database went down and you didn't have the transaction logs, you didn't really care. And so you would enable circular logging, and that would save you on the disk space, because as you saw a moment ago, those logs, they add up. Just like your database itself will grow and grow and grow, the logs will continue to grow unless you do a backup where those logs are then truncated. But either way, you can stop the logs from growing by enabling circular logging. So you might say, well, that's a good thing. Let's enable circular logging and let's eliminate all those extra transaction logs. But it's important to note that when you enable circular logging and those transaction logs do not build up, then you're actually affecting your ability to backup and restore data. So essentially, when it's enabled, you can only perform full backups of the Exchange database. You can no longer perform incremental or differential backups because there are no transaction logs to be used there. And then if you have to restore a backup, you'll always lose any data that's been added to the server since the last backup was made, because what typically happens if you have those logs is you can restore your last backup, and then the transaction logs, especially if you've performed best practice and they're not on the same disk as your database, well, if that disk were to go bad that has the database, and now you put in a new disk, you restore your database from a backup, the good news is that the transaction logs will play into the new database, so you won't lose any email. But if you have circular logging enabled and those transaction logs are not being built up in any way, well, then you're actually eliminating your ability to restore to that point in time that the disk went bad and the database went bad. So you're tying your hand. Today's hard disks are massive. It really makes no sense to use circular logging unless your server is running extremely low on hard disk space and you have to use circular logging in that case. Other than that, I don't typically recommend we ever turn on circular logging. In addition, we have limits. You can establish limits at the database level, but you can also establish limits that will actually trump the database limits on the mailboxes themselves. So here, any mailboxes that are part of this database, they will have limits as far as quotas for send and receive for their mailboxes. So at 1.9 gigabytes, the warning will be sent to them. And then at 2 gigabytes, there will be no ability for them to send any more email. And then at 2.3 gigabytes, they will not be able to send or receive email. So that's really the end limit when it comes to that mailbox that's on this database. Now you can select the down arrow and you can choose unlimited, or you can type in a different value here, so you can establish different quotas or limits when it comes to those mailboxes. Now, in addition, notice these options. Keep deleted items for number of days. So you know when a person deletes an email, that email has not really been deleted just yet. It will be kept for, in this case, the default, 14 days. Now during that time, they can actually use Outlook and they can retrieve that email. They can go back in, search for it themselves. You don't even have to be involved. They can go back in and retrieve that email. So you might want to change this number. If you have no problem with disk space and you don't mind retaining emails that have been deleted for a longer period of time, you can up this number to whatever you're comfortable with. Another option is keep deleted mailboxes for and then the number of days. So you know when a person decides, you know what, I'm leaving the company, or perhaps they've been fired. And so somebody comes in and says, so and so has left, delete their mailbox. Okay, you can do that. You can delete their mailbox. But let's say it was a hasty situation, someone was just angry, or there was a change of heart in some way, and so the person returns. And if they return within the 30-day limit, then you can easily restore their mailbox. You don't have to worry about restoring it from a backup. So that's the value of the 30-day limit there, because as cooler heads prevail or other negotiations perhaps work themselves out, you can restore that mailbox easily. However, you can also increase this time as well, so that you give yourself as much time as possible if you start to see that people are kind of coming and going and they're exceeding the 30-day limit. Maybe make it 45 or 60 days so that you can restore that mailbox easily without having to go to your backups. Now another option here, don't permanently delete items until the database is backed up. That's a good option to actually have turned on if you have an organization that doesn't do backups pretty regularly. So, I mean, if you're looking at 14 days, you should be doing backups daily, and that should not be a problem whatsoever for your organization. But if you are concerned about this, you can make it so that it doesn't permanently delete items until that database is backed up. So as far as the warning message interval, when those warning messages will go out that are sent up here, well, you can see they're sent at midnight. You don't want those messages sent in the middle of the day and disrupting people during work or utilizing the services that your Exchange server has to perform during the day. So you can have it set for this time, or you can change that setting. As we scroll down, you can customize it and make it for a different time that those emails go out. And then over here we see client settings, where in this case you can choose an offline address book for those that are part of this mailbox database. Alright, so now you've pretty much seen the various options to managing the database itself. You can work with these different options and you can see how they're easy to use here, but one of the other things that we might want to take a look at is you can see it's a mounted database. By hitting the More button, you can see that you can also dismount this database. It gives us a warning. We say yes. Now it's dismounted. So if we hit the three buttons there again, now we can remount it. And everything that we're doing here can also be done through the Exchange Management Shell. It's easier at times to do some of this through the Exchange Admin Center, and so whenever I can use the GUI, I prefer the GUI, but again, all of this is doable through the Exchange Management Shell. And we can see it's mounted again. Okay, so let's jump back over to our slides and let's review what we're going to do from a scenario perspective. We're not really going to do too much when it comes to databases here. We have a very simple setup with Spytech Prime, but let's make a few changes to bring things in our organization better into alignment with best practice. Okay, so from a scenario perspective with Spytech Prime, we're going to create a new mailbox database that conforms to the best practices for logs and database files. So we have two separate volumes that are set up. One is set up for transaction logs and the other is set up for the database file itself. We're going to create that new mailbox database and make sure that the logs and the database file go in separate locations. And certainly get off of the system drive, which is also the location for where we have Exchange installed. After that, we're going to move over our users to the new database. Then we will dismount the databases that are no longer used, and then we will adjust the following database limits. We're going to change the deleted item retention time to 30 days. We're also going to select the link that will make it so that we don't permanently delete any items until a backup is performed. Okay, so let's jump over to our server and let's perform these various tasks. Alright, so first of all, in order to complete our scenario, we had to make a change to our server. We had to increase the server's volumes, and what we did was, if we go to Computer, you can see here that we now have two new volumes. We have a volume letter E, and that's going to be for our database and EDB. That's why I chose the E letter there. And we have new volume T, and that's for the transaction logs. And if we just look here, each one has a folder that's been created so that we have a very clear place to put our EDB file, our database, for our new POS DB1 Exchange database file. And then if we go back here, we have a folder for the logs, POS DB1 logs. And so in doing this, we're following best practices. We're getting the transaction logs and the database off of the C drive altogether, and we're separating them from each other. In a perfect world, this would actually be a RAID 5 array of some sort. This would be a mirrored set or something of that sort. But in our case, we're simply just adding these as volumes, and so you can let your imagination run wild and assume that that's what these are. All right, let's create our new database. If we go to our Exchange Admin Center, we go back to Servers, we go over to Databases, we'll click the plus sign to create our new database. It's POS DB1. We click Browse. We only have the one server, so we'll leave it at that. And note, it tries to put it right in the normal database path, the C drive. So we're going to change this. We have to leave the POS DB1 part. So what we're going to do is we're going to change this to E:// and then we already have this folder, POS DB1, and that will be the name of the database file. And then the log folder path is T for transaction logs. It's POS DB1 logs. Okay, and we'll let it mount the database after it's created. We click Save. And we can see we have the database there. It is mounted. We get the information here on the right-hand side. If we go back to our folders here, we go back to the folder POS DB1, we see there's our EDB file. And the logs are set up to go to here. All right, so we've just followed best practice in that sense. However, we need to move over our mailboxes at this point. So there's a couple of different ways to do that. There are easy ways we can do it by going through migration. We can select all of the different files here if we do that. We can choose Move Mailbox to another database. It does the same exact thing as if we opened up the migration link here and went through that process. We'll give it a name. We don't have an archive mailbox, so we can just move primary mailbox only. The target database, POS DB1. Click Next. We'll leave the default options for starting the batch. We're going to automatically start the batch now. The administrator will receive the report, and it will automatically complete the migration batch. So we'll click New. And while that migration is happening, we'll jump back over to Servers. Back to Databases. And at this point, we're just going to dismount the original database. We had no mailboxes in there to start with, so we will dismount that database. And we can see it's dismounted at this point. We can delete it. We can go forward and get rid of it completely. We're not going to do that just yet. We'll leave it there for now. It's dismounted. It's not being used. And the last thing we're going to do here as part of our scenario is we're going to go back to the POS DB1. We're going to edit the properties. We'll go to Limits. And remember, we're going to change the deleted item retention from 14. That's the default. we're going to make it 30 days, and we're going to select Don't permanently delete items until the database is backed up. And we'll click Save. Okay, and so this pretty much covers the various scenario tasks that we were given. We have created the new mailbox database, moved over our users to the new database. We've dismounted the first database. We'll dismount the second one once the move is complete. And we've adjusted the database limits to have deleted item retention up to 30 days, whereas the default is 14. We've also made sure that we will not permanently delete any of the items until a backup has been performed. And most importantly, out of all of this, we have created a database that follows best practices. It gets the database off of the system drive and the drive where Exchange was installed, gets it onto its own volume, and at the same time we've split the transaction logs from the database so that now we have a little bit more resiliency there as well. So we hope you found this informative. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next lesson.